a song of celebration. Lift up a shout of praise, for the bridegroom will come. The glorious one, and oh, we will look on his face. We'll go to another
not being a pixelated face, but to be here with you. It's so good to share with one another and to, like we've been saying, the isolation, to break the isolation and to connect with you. And I pray that through the word that I'm going to share this morning, that you'll resonate with this word, that you'll keep in mind what Michael's just said, God's blueprint, God's plan for the salvation of the world, and part of that, I hope, will come through this morning. So I want to share a story with you this morning. It's a story of one who didn't fit in. It's a story of a hijacking, an exodus. It's a Jewish story, and this is my story. I've lived most of my life not fitting in. I was born Jewish, but I grew up Christian. My dad's Jewish and my mom's not. And so as we'd go to Jewish family events, life cycle events, we wouldn't really be accepted. Our Jewish family do not accept Jesus, and because we do, they do not consider us as Jewish. So although my family in particular does still somewhat include us, we really don't fit in there. And then in a similar way, in church circles, I never truly fit in because I'm Jewish. And so what had happened was that I'd grown up my whole life with this identity crisis. Am I Jewish or am I Christian? Actually, before we go much further, take a step back, and I'm sure some of you remember my wife Elise and I from last year. It was really great to be with you all. So a request at this point is if you would keep us in your prayers. That'd be amazing. We really do covet your prayers as we take the word of God to our Jewish brethren, our Jewish friends and family, sharing the truth of Messiah. We really do covet your prayers. Unfortunately, Elise wasn't able to join me on this trip, but she sends her regards. And it's so good that I can be with you. Again, if you want to connect with us, you can either fill out a card, or if you are that way inclined, you can take a shot at the screen and follow the QR code to our website and get in touch with us. We would love to keep the conversation with you going, to keep in touch with you. Yeah, so back to my story. Am I Jewish or am I Christian? I don't really fit in. When I was almost 6 years old, there was an event that happened that would then just pour fuel on this fire of this brewing identity crisis in my life. It was 2 months before my 6th birthday. It was Guy Fawkes night, and we were on our way, my parents, my younger sister and me, were on our way to a family bride at my grandparents' house, and as we pulled up to the gate, we were surrounded by 12 men, and they were all armed, and they hijacked us. They took all of our valuables. By the grace of God, they didn't harm us. But for me, as an almost 6-year-old, it was a very confusing time, it was a very chaotic time, it was a traumatic time. And at the age of 6 years old, I was old enough to know what was going on, to know what was happening, to know that they meant us no good. But I wasn't really old enough to be able to process what was happening, to process the experience. And so what happened is that a deep sense of fear and insecurity took root in the middle of my identity crisis in the wake of this hijacking. And that fear, that insecurity that had taken root would grow, and it would grow and grow throughout my life. And so what had happened was that fear had become my Pharaoh. This morning I want to ask each and every one of you, who is your Pharaoh? Who's your slave master? Is it work? Family? Is it health? Is it security? Or is it fear like me? Well, when I was 8 years old, my family and I went to Israel to visit some of my dad's family, and it was an incredible experience for a young guy as we traveled around the country, and I began to fall in love with the people, the culture, with the language, with the places, and I began to develop, for the first time in my life, a sense of connection to my Jewish heritage. As we traveled around, we saw the places where many of the Bibles, or the stories from the Bible, I was learning about and reading about for myself, saw where these places took place. And one of my favorite memories was in the area of the Dead Sea, in the desert south of Judea, south of Jerusalem. And we climbed Masada. And I've got a photo from no, not yet. We climbed Masada, and we looked out from Masada over the Dead Sea and the Jordan River Valley, and we looked across into the land of modern-day Jordan, which would have been the time of the biblical times, the land of Moab. And then from Masada, we went into there was such a stark contrast, this harsh, arid climate. We went next door to the oasis of En-Gedi. And there's such an amazing contrast, this lifeless waters of the Dead Sea, this harsh, arid desert, and this lush, green oasis. And for us that day, in the heat, it was an oasis. We took shelter under the waterfall, and we cooled off, and it was an amazing time. It was a sanctuary for us in this harsh and thirsty land. But the problem was that when we came back from Israel, I could find no sanctuary. I could find no rest because of this fear that had taken root in my heart in the middle of my identity crisis. And that's the problem, that when you're living your life under Pharaoh, enough is never enough. No matter how good you are, it's never good enough. Just like my ancestors, no matter how many bricks they made for Pharaoh, that became the new standard, and tomorrow you have to make more. And the problem was that about the age of 5 years old, I had made a conscious decision of my own to follow Jesus as my Messiah. But all the way along, I was living enslaved to Pharaoh. So I was following Jesus, and I confessed with my mouth, but I was still, my heart was still enslaved by Pharaoh, enslaved for me by fear. But God. And God is the one who leads us out of our slavery if we will follow him. And so what comes next is the story of my exodus. I had this dream pretty much all my life to ride on a motorbike across Africa. I don't really know where it came from, but it was just there. And so, coming up for 10 years now, 2011, on the 23rd of June, my dad and I joined the whole group of riders, left Cape Town, headed on a 2.5-month adventure across Africa. One of the things that we had to do in preparation for the trip was to prepare not only ourselves and our minds, but also our bikes. And the organizer of the trip had helped us to prepare our bikes and to do some necessary upgrades, but the most important upgrade that we had to do was to replace our rear shock absorber. And the organizer of the trip had done the trip himself a number of times. He'd gone up and down, so he knew the demands of the roads and the climates, and he knew what lay ahead of us. And so we fitted these upgraded shock absorbers, also with his guarantee that he was there to support us. He had backup vehicles, and so if anything were to go wrong, he would help us repair our bikes and replace the shock absorber if it were to blow. And so this gave us a lot of confidence as we rolled out of Cape Town and we headed northwards. But just like the exodus of my ancestors, my exodus was not without its challenges, because you see, Pharaoh does not let his slaves go without a fight. So as we headed into northern Kenya, to a desert called the Chalbi Desert, the tar ran out, and we had a little bit of over 500 kilometers of the harshest desert climate that I've ever encountered. The roads I've never encountered, even with the potholes on our South African roads, I've never encountered a road quite like this one. As I rolled off that tar road onto the gravel road, I can't describe to you how rough it was. It was rutted upwards, downwards, leftways, sideways. It was so rough that literally my teeth began to chatter. So we would have to endure this climate, this road. Not only was it the wrong side of 45 degrees, but our bikes and our bodies would take such a punishing that we'd have to ride agonizingly slowly for the next 2.5 days. And this is some more photos of this road. But you can't quite see the perspective in the photo is that the rut that my bike is in is just about as high as my knee. We had to ride at times on this volcanic rock that was like marbles. At times, 360 degrees. All you could see was nothing. You could see the curvature of the earth for 360 degrees. We were in the middle of absolutely nowhere. It was sweltering hot and this incessant vibration from the road. So a measly, an agonizing half an hour into this road. And we stopped the first of what would be many, many breaks to rest and then give our bodies a respite. It's also to get our bikes a respite. As I got off my bike and I tried to see the world come back down to flat, everything stopped buzzing, feel the vibration in my fingers, looked at my bike, and I noticed that my shock absorber was busy depositing all its oil onto the desert sand. So I was quite surprised by this, obviously, because we upgraded this shock absorber for this exact piece of road. But I knew that there was a spare, and I knew that the organizer was there, and that we could repair my bike, so I went over to him, and I showed him what was happening, and to my utter dismay, he looked at me, shrugged his shoulders, and said, "Can I say it right to Ethiopia?" And while I was still trying to process what had just happened, aren't you supposed to have me repair? Everyone jumped on their bikes, and the convoy was moving northwards. So I had no time to even respond. I had to jump on my bike, and without a jump, I almost bounced off my bike. Again, it was just a spring, and it became a pogo stick. And so while I was trying to process what was going on, trying to process the emotions that were now stirring up in the heat, I was having to figure out how to ride this bouncing bike on the roads, and it presented a new challenge to me. And while I was trying to figure out how to ride, I was having these emotions that were welling up. Disappointment, broken promises. There's a whole comedy of errors that had also led up to that point, and there were some group dynamics that were unfolding, and all of this was just being added, fuel to the fire, and it was like this pressure cooker inside of me, these emotions building and building and building. And then a couple of hours later, another set of broken protocol left about 2/3 of the group separated from the backup vehicles. We were going to be spending that night with a tribe in the middle of the desert called the Samburu, and the backup vehicle had picked up one of the guys who was going to show us the way to the camp. And I saw the backup vehicle, which was supposed to be behind the last rider, tear past me and disappear off into the desert in the middle of nowhere. At first I thought it was just me and one or two other guys, but it pretty quickly turned out that it was about 2/3 of the group. And now the tempers were flaring. Sense of humor gone. Anger was building again, not just in me, but in others. But in me, it was just this turmoil of emotions. And as we eventually made our way to camp that night, as we had to circle in, try and figure out where this camp was, by the time we eventually made it to camp, I was in no mood to see anyone. I was in no mood for anyone. I put my tent up, climbed into my tent, I zipped it closed, I shut everyone out, especially the organizer. I was trying to shut the world out, and I put my iPod on, and I just blocked the whole world out, and I began raging. I was raging against the world. I was looking for someone or something to blame for my plight. Lying in my tent here in the middle of the Chalbi Desert, literally and metaphorically cooking, the Lord tapped me on my shoulder and He said to me, "You got yourself into the situation. What are you going to do about it?" What am am I going to do about it? I didn't get myself into this situation. What am I going to do about it? Someone else is to blame. Something else is to blame. And as I began to think about this, the Lord began to show me that underneath my anger was actually a sadness. It was a sadness that I carried with me my whole life. It was a sadness that was birthed out of that fear and anxiety from the hijacking all those many years ago. And then I remembered something that my dad would tell my sister and me as we grew up. He told us many, many times. He said, happiness is a choice. You can choose to be happy or you can choose to be sad. And it's not that I didn't believe that this was true, but it wasn't true for me. Because my experience was that I didn't choose my sadness. I didn't choose to be born Jewish and to grow up Christian. I didn't choose to be hijacked at gunpoint. I didn't choose to not fit in and not be good enough. How could I choose to not be sad? The Lord began to show me that I had a choice. In one way or another, I would choose. And many years later now, as I look back, I realize that in that moment, lying in this tent, in the middle of the Chobe Desert, that the Lord was planting a seed in me. And like any seed, the seed takes time to grow, and to take root, to bear fruit. One part of that seed that the Lord was sowing in me was that He was showing me that one of the greatest gifts that He's given each and every single one of us is the gift of free choice, free will. We get to choose. But what He showed me is that not making a decision is also choosing. And so as I was wrestling with my fear, my anger, my sadness, lying in my tent, the Lord was showing me that it was much more than just these emotions. It was much more than just fear and sadness. It was actually about two kingdoms, a kingdom of light and a kingdom of darkness. And I was standing in the middle of the two. And I had to choose which master I was going to serve, which Pharaoh I was going to submit to. Was I going to continue to submit to fear as my Pharaoh? Or was I going to choose to let go of that, choose to leave the land of my slavery and go on a journey that the Lord would lead me on as He would take me to His promised land. And so in reality, it was actually quite an easy choice. I chose to let go. I chose to let the Lord lead me out of the land of my slavery. So the next days were not easy. I had to get myself out of the situation. I realized I did get myself into the situation, and I had to get myself out. And each agonizing moment of that unrelenting road was very difficult, especially riding my broken bike. But while the road was tough, the going was light. The first time in my life, I carried with me a lightness that I've never experienced before. And that makes me think of the words of Jesus, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." The yoke and the burden of my slave, the land of my slavery, of my slave master of fear was heavy. I'm sure you all know the toll that our slave masters put on us. But I carried this lightness for the first time in my life. I was able to make it out of that desert, made it into Ethiopia eventually, where I was able to repair my bike. I was able to fit a new shock absorber. Incidentally, with the organizer nowhere to be found, but I repaired my bike, and we were able to carry on northwards and head towards our destination, which was Cairo. But then the day before we got to Cairo, something very interesting happened. We'd been delayed getting our bikes through customs, coming out of the Sudan, coming into Egypt. We had a lot of ground to cover that day. had to be in Cairo the following day. So we were all really eager to get going, to start making progress, but it was about 3 p.m. by the time all the bikes had cleared customs and we were ready to go. And then not long after we set off, because it was Ramadan at the time, just after dusk, all of the locals would break their fast and they would come out onto the streets to celebrate the breaking their fast for the day. And so as I came out onto the streets, this slowed our progress even more, and so it was very frustrating, it was very slow going. And for some reason or another, I found myself the very last bike in the line. I always preferred to ride close to the front, but I just happened to be the very last bike in the whole convoy of about 19 motorcycles. Then I noticed a couple of cars and a few buses parked up on the side of the road. That's odd. And then I noticed a lot more cars and more buses parked up, and this seemed very odd to me. What are these vehicles doing parked up in literally the middle of nowhere? And then I looked up, and the front end of this line of motorcycles, I saw that there was a crowd in the road, and they looked to me from the back of the line to be quite a jovial crowd, and I just assumed that they would be celebrating breaking their fast for the day, like all the other locals. But then something unusual happened, and the whole line of bikes turned around. And so I went from being the last bike in the line to being the second bike in the line behind the lead rider. And so I had a front row seat for what unfolded next. The whole convoy moved a couple of kilometers back down the road. And when we stopped, we quickly learned that this was not a jovial crowd at all. This crowd was an angry mob with sticks and clubs. And whatever their grievance was, we stood between them and it. And they were going to club us out the way if necessary. And so we had to pretty quickly scramble to figure out what's going on. And once again, just like my hijacking experience all those years ago, it was a confusing and a chaotic time. And while we were still trying to figure out how we are going to get ourselves out of the situation, trying to figure out which way do we go when the only road between us and Cairo has an angry mob on it advancing towards us. So friends, this morning I want to ask you, which way do you go when there is no way to go? Well, I'm here to tell you this morning that we serve a God who makes a way where there is no way. Because while we're still trying to figure out what we were going to do about it, this local Egyptian man, wearing a long white traditional robe, riding this little motorbike appeared, and on the back of his bike he had a young boy, probably about 5 or 6 years old. And I don't even remember if he spoke to us. I don't even remember if he said anything, but basically he just motioned for us to follow him. And this guy led us off the road into the darkness towards the Nile. And he took us over irrigation ditches, took us past little huts and little fields. I have absolutely no idea where we went. But at every turn, this little boy, just in front of me on the back of his bike, would look back. And every time I looked back, I looked at this boy and I thought, there's something about this boy that reminds me of myself as a young boy. But then as I looked at him, every time he would turn back, it was like he was making sure everyone was safe, everyone was following. It was like he was making sure that we were all safe, that we were all there. And it felt like he was leading us. And I suddenly realized that there's something about this young boy that does not remind me of myself at all. There was this peace, but there was an authority about him that I didn't recognize in myself. But I didn't have any time to think about it because the next thing we popped up back on the main road, and as I looked back, I fully expected to see the back of this angry mob, and then we'd have to gaff it and get out of there. But as I looked back, the road behind was completely clear, and as I looked up ahead, there was not a soul in sight. And just as suddenly as this unknown rider had appeared, he and the little boy waved goodbye to us and then disappeared into the darkness. And I can't say with any certainty, but I truly believe in my heart that at least one of them was an angel probably that little boy, sent by the Lord to lead us to safety. So, in a foreign land, where we didn't speak the language, where we didn't understand the culture, found ourselves in this situation of grave danger, the Lord made a way where there wasn't a way. And much like my hijacking experience all those years ago, where this should have been a very traumatic, chaotic time, this experience was quite different. There was a sense in me all the way through of this deep sense of peace and calmness. And I believe that what the Lord was doing for me in that moment was that He was redeeming my hijacking experience, redeeming what had been stolen from me, redeeming what had been given to me in its place. Not only have they stolen my valuables, but they'd also stolen partly my right, my ability to choose. They'd also stolen my authority. They'd stolen my identity. And the Lord was busy redeeming. So we were able to safely make it onto our destination, to get to Cairo. Or so we thought that was our destination. This is a shot of my dad and I in Cairo. And if you look closely in the distant background, faintly, you might be able to see some of the pyramids. But just like what's happened to all of us during lockdown, we all thought we had our plans, and we all thought we knew where we were going. We all thought we knew where our destination was. But God had different plans for us. Fortunately, we were able to realize what those plans were. We were able to be obedient. And so what we did from Cairo is we left the group, just my dad and I, and we crossed under the Suez Canal. We crossed into the Sinai Desert. And from there, we went to the east side of the Sinai Peninsula, to the shores of the Gulf of Aqaba. And from the Sinai Peninsula in Nuweiba, from the beachhead, in all likelihood the very same beachhead that my ancestors were led into. Much like them, we crossed over the Red Sea. Unlike them, it was on a dry boat, not on dry land. But we too crossed over. We landed in Jordan. And from Aqaba, we turned northwards and we headed towards Amman, the modern-day land of Jordan, but as I mentioned earlier, the biblical land of Moab. And just on the outskirts of Amman, we turned westward. We got to the escarpment, the edge of the Moab escarpment, overlooking the Jordan River Valley, overlooking the Dead Sea, into the promised land, the land of our promise, the land of our true destination, the land of our rest. Couldn't get a better picture than this. We had to snap a quick shot and carry on because we were in a rush against time to get to the border, to cross over. We'd been in contact with my dad's aunt and uncle, and they were going to meet us on the Israeli side. And after 2.5 months of crossing Africa, we were ready to enter the land of our rest. But we got to the Jordanian border post just in time for them to roll some barrels in the road in front of us and to send us away for an hour or so because it was still Ramadan. And the border guards closing the border so that they could break their fast. So we were feeling this tension. We wanted to get out of Jordan and into Israel. We were eager to get there, but we had to wait for them to open up again. And when they did, we then had to begin the arduous process of navigating the red tape. As we eventually made our way through and tried to untangle ourselves from all the red tape, we got to the last point in that process. But by this point, it was 9 p.m., the time at which the border would close. And so they radioed across to the Israelis to say, "We've got 2 South Africans on motorbikes, can we send them across?" The reply came to who and what? They didn't know what to make of us, so they said, okay, we'll send them across and we'll decide. So the Jordanians allowed us to go through, and we got to what felt much like a toll booth. In front of me was this huge gate, this boom, and the traffic light turned green, and the gate started to open, and the boom came up, and the spike strips came down. And as I looked up, started to move, I saw the squad of Israeli border policemen move into formation with their rifles at ready. And I thought to myself, best I not make any sudden moves, because it's going to be my last. As I slowly rolled out of Jordan, over that bridge, over the Jordan River, I crossed over into Israel, put my foot down. We were surrounded by border guards, border policemen, and they started to interrogate us immediately. Who are you? Where do you come from? What are you doing here? We started to explain, we're South African, but we're Jewish, we've been to Israel before, we've got family in Israel. No, they were having absolutely none of it. And the more we tried to explain, the less they were having of it. And then they were saying, oh, where have you come from again? We crossed Africa on motorbikes to come to Israel. Oh, so you've been through all the terrorist hotspots, through Sudan, through Egypt, through Jordan, through Sinai. Oh, yes, of course, how else do you get from Cape Town to Israel? And the tension was just building and building and building. And the more we explained, the more we tried to explain, the more the tension was building. And then we looked up, and through the fence, you could see my dad's aunt and uncle who'd come to meet us. And my dad's uncle, many years before that, had been in the Israeli border police. And he still carries in his wallet his reserve ID card. And it was only when he showed them his ID card that the tension released. They started to believe our story, and they allowed us to come through. They wanted to send us back into Jordan. But because of this ID card that my dad's uncle carries with him, we were allowed to enter Israel, to our final destination, to the land of our rest. And so it was each one of us. If you leave the land of your slavery, if you leave your Pharaoh, as I said earlier, he doesn't let you go without a fight. You can only cross over into the promised land, not on your credentials. It doesn't matter who you are, what you say you are, what you say you've done. That does not matter. You will not be allowed to cross over and enter in. It's only with the credentials of someone with the appropriate authority that we can be given the right to cross over and enter that land. It's only with the credentials of Messiah Jesus, through his blood, the ID card of his blood. We sang of it earlier. The blood that he shed for us. It's only through his blood that we can cross over and enter in. And once I left the land of my slavery, I was no longer enslaved by fear as my Pharaoh. But where does all this leave me with my identity crisis? Am I Jewish? Am I Christian? One of the things that the Lord has been showing me, as I reflect back on the past year, as I reflect back on the past years, as I reflect back on my exodus, the Lord has been showing me that, as someone much wiser than me once said, an unexamined life is not worth living. I want to encourage you in that, to examine your life, reflect, look back. We've been very privileged during lockdown to be given forced rest. But I want to encourage you to take the intention about it, take time to reflect, look back. One of the things that the Lord has been showing me as I reflect is that the questions that we ask oftentimes are not the right questions. They're not the questions that need answering. They're the questions we want answered, but they're not the questions we need answered. So what the Lord has been showing me is that the question at the heart of my identity crisis, am I Jewish or am I Christian? Why don't I fit in? That was not the right question at all. What he's been showing me is that the question is not who am I? The true question of my identity crisis is whose am I? It's not about who I am, what I've done, what I can do. It's about whose I am. And so my identity crisis is resolved by being God's son, by being his. And it doesn't matter who I say I am, it doesn't matter who I am, it only matters who he says I am. And it's only with that we're truly able to leave the land of our slavery, to leave our Pharaoh. And although I'd professed when I was 5 years old to follow Jesus, and I truly tried to, I really did, I was enslaved by another slave master. So it's only when I chose to let go, chose to leave the land of my slavery, to cross over into the land of the promise, that my identity crisis was resolved. And so once again I found myself in Israel, again at the top of Matzada, looking back out over the Jordan River Valley, over the Dead Sea. But this time, I couldn't see the other side. The haze had blurred it out, and I truly was in the land of my rest. So interwoven into my story, somewhat covertly, is what we mentioned just before I started speaking, God's blueprint. God's blueprint for salvation of the world comes through Jew and Gentile. And in his grace, he doesn't call us to become one like the other, or one to take on the customs of the other. Not at all. In his grace, God reunites us, each individually, but also corporately, first to himself, and then to one another. So it's only in Messiah that Jew and Gentile can be united. God's word says, where there is unity, he commands a blessing. My story is that I was born to a Jewish father and a Gentile mother, and in his grace the Lord gave to me an Afrikaans wife, Jew and Gentile again. And it's only in his grace that we can be united, Jew and Gentile, in one new man. Both Jew and Gentile being created into something new. And the very fact that Michael and I are here this morning, the very fact that you are here this morning, means that you too are part of that blueprint. You're part of God's plan of salvation for the whole world. To the Jew first, and then to the Gentile, together, united in Messiah as one new man. So I'd like to leave you with a Hebrew blessing. Would you all please stand? Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. Ye'er Adonai panav elecha v'yichunecha. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he keep you away from the land of your slavery. May he keep you in his promise. May he keep you in the land of his promise, the land of his rest. May he make his countenance to shine upon you. May he give you peace, not a peace that comes from this world, but a peace, a shalom, that comes from our Prince of Peace, Yeshua HaMashiach. May you have the courage to let go whatever it is that's in your hands, to let go whatever it is that you're holding on to, or whatever it is that you feel might be holding on to you, to let go, and to leave the land of your slavery, to cross over in the authority of our Prince of Peace. enter into his rest. And then the seeds that he's sown in you, as I've shared my story, pray that you would have found pieces of your own story in it. May you reflect on your story, and may you sow those seeds, and then reap a ripe harvest, 30, 60, 100-fold, as you sow seeds of one new man wherever you go. As you walk that journey, as we together become united, one new man. Amen.
Amen.